I'm trying to calculate whether this is the 16th or 17th year. And you notice us calculating, but we didn't have the help of Sharon, who usually knows the right number. So we decided that this is the 16th edition of CAOS. And if you're wrong, it's okay. Nothing hinges on this. Welcome all to this 16th edition of CAOS. I recognize many faces, people who have come many other times, and also lots of new faces. Welcome. I think, well, people who've been here many years, come many times, know the way it works. The way it works is that we have the speaker speak for 45 minutes, and then we have half an hour for discussion. Not a typical type of distribution of time. The reason we have 30 minutes is because some of the people here are rather contentious individuals, and they want to make sure that their point of view is reflected in the discussion, and they sometimes disagree with the speaker, and they just ask questions and complain, and I'm not using this properly. Oh, it is better? This is just an anecdote. A friend of mine, some older Italians remember this, organized a meeting, and it was in one of these sort of old churches that was no longer being used as a church, and it was a pulpit, and he was speaking from there to introduce the topic, and he picked up something, and he was speaking into it, and it wasn't a mic, it was a pointer, and once in a while he would push, and then the light would show on his face. Okay, that has not happened to me. This is almost as bad. So we have a time for discussion, and we hope that especially the younger people get to ask their questions. As I said, we have some older, more contentious people, excluding me, who ask many questions, but it would be nice if younger people got a chance to ask their questions. I don't have any other announcements to make. I'm really excited to see so many of you again, and I'd like to introduce the speaker, the first speaker today, and that's Dr. Wilma Bainbridge. And she's from the University of Chicago, and the title of her talk is Memories and Predictable. Thank you. Welcome.
Can you all hear me okay? Am I coming over the microphone? Okay. Yeah, so first I wanted to preface by thanking the committee for inviting me. So the first time I came to CAOS was actually 12 years ago. As a just starting out PhD student, I was super nervous, didn't know anyone here, but except for I really admired all the speakers who were here, so I remember watching all the talks with like stars in my eyes. And then I came back here 6 years later as a postdoc, where I was really nervous about like, what is my future? Will I get a faculty job? I was right in the midst of the interview process. And now here I am 6 years after that, able to stand up here and give you guys a talk about my work. So really honored to be here, and I'm sure many of you will end up having the same sort of progression in your life. So I'm going to tell you about how your memories are really predictable. So let me first have you be a participant in my experiment. So I'm going to show you a stream of face images, and what I want you to do is clap your hands when you recognize a face from earlier in that stream. Okay, you all ready? Okay, here we go. Wait, no, you shouldn't have clapped on the first. These are all novel face images, unless if you've seen me give this demo before. Okay, good. Okay, that was the correct response. Yeah. Okay, so even though I'm meeting many of you for the first time today, you acted exactly as I would have expected. So first, I put her face in there to make sure you understood the task, because I heard someone clap on the first face. So. And then her face I put in there because I know she causes a lot of false memories. I actually didn't hear anyone clap on her face. I did hear a lot of people clap on another high false alarm face. So there are just some faces that cause a lot of false memories, even if you only see them a single time. For this face, you guys were confident, did a great job clapping for his face, and that's what I'd expect because I know his face is very memorable. You also did an okay job at clapping for her face, but I saw some of you were more delayed in your clap for her, or maybe quieter, and that's what I expect because her face is fairly forgettable. And so what this reflects is that, and that's not always a bad thing, you can be a forgettable spy. So, so what this reflects is this idea that images have this intrinsic memorability, which I define as the likelihood of remembering that image. And we've actually found this using some large-scale online experiments with thousands of images, hundreds or thousands of participants, where online they do that exact same task where they see a stream of images, and instead of clapping their hands, they press a key on their keyboard to indicate a recognition for a repeat of that image. And so in that key press, we get the hit rate, or the proportion of people who correctly recognize that image. And then we also get a false alarm rate, so the proportion of people who made a false memory response the first time they saw an image. And what we've found in our work is that if you take random halves of participants and correlate basically their memory performance for the images, we find that people are really similar in the images that they remember, and also really similar in the images that they have false memories for, that they false alarm to. So in other words, there are some images that everyone remembers, some that everyone forgets, and that means you can think of an image as having this intrinsic memorability. And we've found this not just for faces, but some of my colleagues have found these effects for scenes. We found this for face identities. So it's not just about the photograph. If you're memorable when you're smiling, you're also memorable when you're looking away. We've also found these for words. So stimuli with relatively low visual information, but rich semantic information. We've even seen these effects for really dynamic stimuli, like dance moves. So if a dance move is memorable when a ballerina is doing it, it's also memorable when a stick figure is doing it. And we also have some recent work finding it also works in the auditory domain. So there are just some voices that are inherently memorable or forgettable. And so what I'm going to propose in this talk is that this consistency across people in what they remember may reflect something fundamental about the mechanisms of memory. And so to illustrate this, I'm going to describe two studies in detail. So first, I'm going to go over a study showing how generalizable these memorability effects really are. And then I'm going to delve into what makes objects memorable. And so because memorability is a property of a stimulus, that means theoretically it's directly computable from a stimulus. And so we've developed a neural network, a deep learning neural network called 𝗕𝗲𝗻, which is currently the state of the art in predicting the memorability of an image. It was developed by my master's student, Cohen Nidal. I can go into details about the architecture later if people are curious, but basically it doesn't have any memory built into it. It's sort of like a visual architecture. It's like ResNet or AlexNet combined, if you've seen those before. So we take this very visual architecture, and then we train it on people's memory performance in that same task for about 60,000 real-world photographs. And what we find is that it actually does remarkably well at predicting people's memory in that same sort of task. So here in the blue histogram here shows people's actual memory performance for images, and in orange shows the distribution of the predictions made by our neural network. And its predictions correlate 0.68 with actual human memory performance. And we've tried to make 𝗕𝗲𝗻 very easy to use. It's publicly available. It has an easy Python package. And you can even just log onto our website and upload a picture from your phone or your computer and get back the memorability score for that photo. And so we were curious, do these memorability effects generalize to the real world? And we thought, to test this, when are we out in the world looking at images with the goal of trying to remember those images? Well, I would argue that when you visit an art museum, that is exactly your goal. You want to remember your visit and remember the pieces of art that you experience. And as a side note, if any of you have seen this great 80s comedy, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, this poignant scene takes place at the Art Institute of Chicago, so please come visit. Great site, yeah. And so we were curious, what do we remember in a museum visit, and can we predict people's memory in this very naturalistic setting? And the answer is not obvious because, as you might imagine, appreciation of artwork is highly personal, and your memories might be idiosyncratic based on what you know about art and what you feel about art. Also, visiting a museum involves more than just viewing images in this constrained experimental setting, right? There's a spatial component of where pieces are located, how big they are. There's a social component of how you discuss pieces with your friends. There's your prior knowledge about the pieces that might influence what you remember, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many factors involved that would impact what you remember. But even so, my really entrepreneurial undergraduate student, Trent Davis, decided to tackle this question by running a study exactly at this Art Institute of Chicago where that scene takes place. And so he asked two questions. First, is memory predictable across people for artwork at all, given its highly subjective, idiosyncratic nature? And then second, is it also predictable in a real-world setting? And so to ask that first question, we first took all the 4,000-ish two-dimensional pieces from the Art Institute's collection and ran them through that same online experiment I showed you earlier, where people saw a stream of images and pressed the key when they recognized one from earlier. And we ran this with over 3,000 participants. And even though artwork is a very subjective and variable stimulus type, we found that people were significantly consistent in what they remembered and forgot. So there was intrinsically memorable and forgettable pieces of art in the collection. We were then curious, how well would our neural network do at predicting people's memory for these images? So we took each of the 4,000 pieces, ran them through ResMem, our neural network, and got out a predicted memorability score. And remember that ResMem was only trained on photographs, so we weren't sure how well it would do with something very different like pieces of art. But we found that its predictions were significantly correlated with human memory performance in this online task. But that being said, I promised you that I would show you memory in the real world. This is, this sort of online experiment is not that naturalistic. So then we were curious, how well could our neural network do at predicting memory out in reality? So to test this question, we ran a study at the Art Institute of Chicago where we had 20 participants visit the American Art Wing, which composed of 2 floors within the larger Art Institute and about 170 pieces. And one key thing is we were only able to run 20 participants because this was right in the midst of COVID-19, like it was 2021. The Art Institute was at limited capacity, so they were only allowing 25% capacity, which actually worked in our favor because they get over 1.5 million visitors a year. So this means that with the limited capacity, our participants could really take their time, see each piece, et cetera. So what we did is we had these 20 participants come during their free time to the Art Institute, and we just told them, freely explore this wing. Just make sure you view every piece at least once, but you can go in any order, you can go with your friends. We won't even have a researcher there. Then, when you're done visiting the gallery, just step out and then go onto your phone and answer this memory test for the pieces that you just saw in the exhibit. And so, basically on their phones, they did this memory task where they would see the pieces that were in the exhibit intermixed with very similar lure images. These lures would come from the same artist, same content types, same time period, and then they had to answer how well they remembered seeing each of those pieces in the exhibit. We also were curious if there were other factors that might relate to what people remember in a real-world museum visit. So we ran a separate online experiment where we got labels for all of our pieces. So we had, for each piece, 40 different people rated how beautiful each piece was, what emotions they felt when viewing the piece, how interesting they found the piece, and how familiar they felt the piece was. And so we got these measures for all 4,000 pieces. Or sorry, no, this is for all 170 pieces that were in the real-world experiment. And we were then curious, what contributes to people's memories? So to test this question, we ran a multiple regression linear model to try and predict people's in-person memory performance for each image. And so here are the factors that we included in our model. We had the floor that the piece was on. So I mentioned briefly there were 2 floors in this exhibit. And the 2 floors had slightly different content types. One had more diverse content and fewer pieces, while the other one had more pieces and more homogeneous content. So you can sort of think of floor as modeling an effect of context. We also included the size of the painting because this was not something our neural network had access to. We also included those 4 attributes that we got ratings on in that separate online study. Importantly, we included the predictions from our neural network. We also were curious if there might be any interactions. So we included factors for how memorable were other pieces in the same vicinity, and also how big were other pieces in the same vicinity. And we also included statistical interactions into our model. Okay, so now I'll show you what came out as significant. So first, we did find a significant effect of context where that floor with fewer and more diverse pieces did end up having higher memory performance overall. We also found that bigger is better, so larger pieces were better remembered. Surprisingly, we found no effect of beauty, emotion, or familiarity. So a piece can be incredibly beautiful, incredibly emotionally evocative, and leave no trace in your memory. But we did find an effect of this interestingness factor. We're looking into what this means right now because we just asked people how interesting is this piece. So we're not exactly sure what people are using or what they're intuiting when they're responding on interestingness, but maybe it's something we can discuss later. Okay, but importantly for me, our neural network was its predictions were a significant predictor for what people remembered and forgot, with a fairly moderate effect size. And then in terms of these sort of interactive or spatial factors, the only thing we found was that if you had a small piece of art, it would benefit by being surrounded by larger pieces of art in memory. But we found no other interactions, so the memorability of surrounding pieces didn't impact your memory for a given piece. And this overall model explained 44% of the variance in people's memory behavior. This was a more theoretically driven model, but if we do like a stepwise regression, throw every possible factor in there, we can explain as much as 53% of the variance in people's memory, which I think is really remarkable given how noisy and complex the real world is, but we can still predict up to over like half of the variance in what people will remember. And what was important for me was that our neural network did play an important part in predicting what people remembered and forgot. So in other words, we find that we can predict what people remember in this messy real world. So one thing about the Art Institute of Chicago is that we have these super famous pieces that you might recognize here, like the Vincent van Gogh self-portrait. Because these pieces are very famous, we did not include them in our experiment because we knew people were going to remember seeing the famous American Gothic. And in fact, the Art Institute's collection has this label in their database for what they consider as famous pieces versus not famous pieces. So even though we didn't analyze them in terms of our human experiment, we were curious, what would our neural network ResMem think about these famous pieces? So we asked ResMem to predict the memorability of famous pieces and then also non-famous pieces and tested how they compared. And what we found was that ResMem predicted that famous pieces were more memorable than non-famous pieces, which I think is really surprising. This sort of suggests maybe part of what makes something famous is that there's something about the features within the image that lasts in your memory and then causes you to sort of tell other people to look at it, causes them to remember it, and then maybe that contributes to the fame of a piece. So in other words, maybe in a way we are predicting the pieces that can last in cultural memory. And so if this sounds like a bit of a stretch, we actually have some new work that supports this hypothesis. So we've also run a separate study run by my former master's student, 𝗕ආ𝗵𝗃, where we wanted to see how well we could predict social media success based on these memorability scores. So we scraped images from Reddit, photo subreddits on Reddit, and what we found was that our neural network can predict social media success. So images that are posted on Reddit that are more memorable cause more or result in more commenting behavior and also more upvotes. So this shows us in real time that if something's memorable, then people might engage with it more and it might become more popular. Yeah. So in terms of future directions of this work, we've recently held a nationwide art contest challenging artists to make memorable and forgettable pieces to see to what degree do artists really have insight into what makes something memorable. Maybe that might underlie how famous artists were able to make memorable pieces. And then we showed these pieces in an art gallery in the south side of Chicago for a month, and tested people's memory when they visited the pieces that were entered into the contest. If you want to learn more, stay tuned, come visit our VSS talk if you'll be there. But long story short, we replicated basically all the results I showed you earlier, where our neural network was able to predict people's memory performance best. But then artists were able to do fairly well too at manipulating people's memory. Okay, so in this first part of my talk, I showed you that this memorability effect is widespread. And memory is predictable for art in these real-world settings and using AI. So now I'm sure a lot of you are curious, what makes things or what makes objects memorable in the first place? And to test this question of what makes things memorable, we use the Things database developed by 𝗕𝗶𝗶𝗴𝗲 and colleagues. You might have heard about it possibly last year if you were here. And so the Things database is a database of over 26,000 images of over 1,800 object categories. And essentially what they do is they sample almost all nameable concrete objects by downloading images from essentially a dictionary. And so we were curious, with this almost comprehensive set of objects, what are the objects people remembered and forgot? And one great thing about the Things database is that they also provide 49 data-derived dimensions that capture a large majority of the variance in people's similarity judgments. So in other words, how do people cognitively organize these objects, and then what are the dimensions that underlie how people organize these objects? And so these dimensions might reflect something like the degree to which an object is an animal, the degree to which it's colorful or resembles royalty. And so we were also curious with these 49 dimensions, how do these dimensions and object categories relate to this memorability factor? And so to look at this question, one of my former master's students, Max Kramer, ran a large-scale study where he collected over 1 million memory ratings for these 26,000 images with close to 13,500 participants. And these 13,500 participants did the same task you guys did at the beginning of the talk, where they saw a stream of images and had to press a key when they recognized a repeat from earlier. And one thing to note is that we only ever included one exemplar per category, so you would only see like one pair of shoes or one tennis ball photo. But each participant saw a random subset of categories that tended to be unique from other participants. They would see basically 100-ish images of the 26,000 images in the Things database overall. And so we were curious, how does memorability relate to the features of these objects? So first, we were curious qualitatively, what does this data look like? What's the spread of memorability? Are there any dimensions that really relate to memorability? And so first, here's just a sense of the spread of these memorability scores for each of the different 1854 object categories. So you can see on the left here, the most memorable category was candy bars, which I definitely agree with. And then on the right, the most forgettable category on average was windshields, which sort of makes sense to me. And importantly, if we do this same split-half correlation analysis, we find that people are significantly consistent in what they remember and forget. So again here, there are some object images that are just more memorable than other ones. Now if we look at the 49 dimensions that is included in the Things database for each of those object images, here I'm going to show you a bar graph of the correlations of each dimension with memorability. The main takeaway, you don't need to read into a lot of detail here, but the main takeaway is that the relationship between each dimension and memorability is variable, and no single feature overwhelmingly explains memorability effects. So we were curious, even if one single dimension doesn't explain memorability effects, do certain types of features do better than others? And so to test this question, we can group those 49 dimensions into two main categories, essentially those that describe more semantic, higher order dimensions, and then those that describe more low-level visual dimensions. So low-level visual dimensions we define as those that are related to color, shape, texture, and then the higher order ones, the semantic dimensions, we define as those that are related to basically those that are not low-level visual dimensions, but they might be related to things like function, superordinate category, So for example, whether it's related to animals or food or tools. And so we were curious how much variance is captured in memorability by each type of dimension. And what we find is that it's really overwhelmingly these semantic dimensions that are carrying the weight, way more than the visual dimensions. So when I showed you the art study, you might have thought, oh, it's just some low-level visual thing like color or brightness that they're picking up on. But no, that's really not the case. It's really that it's something rich about the meaning of an image that results in it being memorable or forgettable. So in other words, semantic dimensions have a stronger influence on memorability than low-level visual dimensions. But even if we combine all 49 dimensions, we actually aren't able to capture that much of the variance in the memorability scores. So we thought maybe memorability is not just a linear combination of these 49 dimensions. Maybe it's related to something more complex, like it's the location of an item within a feature space. So if I asked you what you intuitively think makes something memorable, you'd probably say that, oh, I think something that's sort of weird, distinctive would be what's memorable. And indeed, there is evidence for this in the field, especially in the world of faces. Caricatures are shown to be more memorable than more normal faces. So you might think that distinctive items are the most memorable. But in recent years, our lab has actually found evidence for the opposite in the brain, where actually more prototypical items are more memorable. So we find that memorable items tend to have more similar patterns in the brain than forgettable items. There's also been evidence that it might be a mixed combination of the two. For example, it could be that to be memorable, an item has to be visually distinctive, but semantically typical. So it might have to sort of match it might have to be easy to interpret, but then look very different. And so we were curious, can we see evidence for any of these three hypotheses in using these things data? And so we can look at this question by taking those 49 features for each image and positioning that image then in a 49-dimensional feature space. So basically, you can think of those 49 features as sort of being a coordinate in this 49-dimensional feature space, right? And so here are a bunch of chinchilla images. And so it's just because we have chinchillas at home. So, and so to test this question of whether memorability relates to typicality or distinctiveness, what you can do is compare a given item's similarity to other items in this 49-dimensional feature space by basically doing a correlation of each pair of items within a category and then averaging them. And that gives you a measure of the average similarity of a given chinchilla to all other chinchillas. And you can think of this average similarity as a measure of prototypicality, right? So if you have a very prototypical chinchilla, it should have a very similar representation or 49-dimensional feature vector to other chinchillas. If it's very atypical, it should have a low average correlation with the other ones. So if we get this typicality measure and correlate it with memorability, what we find is that prototypical images tend to be more memorable. So if a chinchilla picture is prototypical of its category, it will be the one that is best remembered. We also tested this question at a superordinate level. So instead of comparing images within the same category, we compared representative images of a category to its broader category. So in this example, how similar is then a cat or a chinchilla to other mammals? And so we can do the same analysis, but it's just that we're comparing the vectors for different images here at the superordinate category. And what we find here is evidence in the same direction, where in general, prototypical categories tend to be more memorable. Though note that this is just leaning in that direction. It's not statistically significant. We're also curious, can we find evidence for this prototypicality effect using a different analysis technique? So we can do this by also looking at items within a neural network-based feature space. Because prior work has shown that these visual neural networks, like VGG16, can be relatively good proxies of the human visual system. Though I see we have talks tomorrow that maybe might argue against that. And you can think of it as the early lower layers pulling out more low-level visual information from an image, while the later layers pull out more higher-order visual information or semantic information for an image. And so we can take basically these layer outputs for each image from the neural network, flatten it out, and then that becomes the address for each image. Rather than that 49-dimensional vector, we have a vector that's the layer outputs. And then we can do that same analysis where we correlate those layer outputs for different exemplars within the same category. So in other words, this lets us look at typicality in terms of more low-level visual representations and higher-level semantic representations. And so here I'm going to show you on the y-axis are the correlations between this neural network-based typicality measure and memorability. And on the x-axis, I'm going to show you the different layers, where on the left are the more low-level visual layers, and on the right are the higher-order visual layers, or more semantic layers. And what we find is generally these bars tend to be above 0. They tend to be positive. Though do note that these are relatively small effects. But we do find that overall, it's more prototypical items at these different layers that are more memorable. In other words, we find evidence for the second hypothesis that it's really the more typical items that are more memorable. And you might be wondering, why would that be the case? That seems sort of counter my intuitions. Well, we also find evidence for this in a totally separate domain. So in a study in collaboration with Zane Xie, who's now faculty at the University of Maryland, we published a study where we suggest that memorability might be a measure of how our memories are organized and how we search that space. So we did an experiment with word memory, but basically we proposed that memorable items are at the roots of our cognitive maps, and then forgettable items are the leaves of our sort of memory networks. And we find evidence for this in our word memory study, where we find that memorable words are recalled faster, and they also show earlier reinstatement in the brain using intracranial EEG recordings than forgettable items. So in some very recent work, we were curious, can we test this same hypothesis in vision? And so to build on this idea, we ran a study led by Fiona Lee, who was my master's student, and now she's here as a PhD student. Yeah, she's here somewhere. And so we were curious, can we find evidence for a similar network-like, tree-like geometric space for images to test this memorability-centric hypothesis, this idea that memorable items are at the roots of our memory networks, forgettable ones are at the leaves. And we can try and test this question using this 49-dimensional feature space that I showed you earlier with the Things database. And to look at this sort of tree-like organization, we can reconceptualize the geometric space that we use. So what I showed you earlier was that each of these images were in a 49-dimensional space, right? And to measure their similarity, we would take the Euclidean distance. So that's basically taking a ruler. I guess I was too excited about the Euclidean distances. Okay, 1 second. So basically, a Euclidean distance is like taking a ruler between your 2 points and measuring how long the distance is, but in this 49-dimensional space. But what we propose is that our cognitive maps are not really organized in a Euclidean way. Perhaps it's more in a tree-like way, where you would want to instead measure something like a discrete tree distance. So here, our measure of distance would be how far are 2 points if you trace back to a common ancestor, right? So the distance here is represented by the dotted line. But the tricky thing is that it's hard to measure a discrete tree distance for continuous stimuli like images that vary continuously on different features, right? And so luckily, there is a way in which you can approximate a discrete tree distance using continuous values, and that's called the hyperbolic distance. So it's essentially a smooth approximation of a discrete tree distance. It looks something like this. And basically, how you measure a hyperbolic distance is you can take your Euclidean space and transform it into a hyperbolic space. It looks sort of like this. The idea is that distances get larger the farther apart, or the farther away from the origin that they are. And so if we can transform our items into a hyperbolic space, then we can measure hyperbolic distances and see if those capture our representations for objects better. And so in this study led by Fiona and our colleagues, we took the 49-dimensional feature space with things. And from that, we have a distance matrix of how far apart is every pair of items in just the normal like Euclidean space. So again, this is just taking the 49-dimensional feature vectors, doing a correlation between them to get distances. And so the question is, what are the best number of dimensions I can match this space, match this matrix, this distance matrix, in the two different spaces that we're curious to look at? In other words, how well does a Euclidean space do at fitting our like cognitive representations of these objects versus how well does a hyperbolic space do? Whoops. And first, when we try and find what's the best fit number of Euclidean dimensions, we find that we can represent a good chunk of the distances here with just 16 dimensions. But these 16 dimensions are not really interpretable, right? Yeah, it's hard to know, maybe they're combinations of different features, but how would we apply these dimensions to other stimulus categories, right? For the hyperbolic space, we find that the best fit space has only 3 dimensions, which is the radius, or the distance of an item to the center, and 2 angular measures. And as a measure of fit, we looked at a chi-squared measure, where basically a higher chi-squared means that the space is more dissimilar from the empirical space or the data that we collected. And what we find is that a Euclidean space has a fairly high chi-squared, so it's not really a great fit for these data, while the hyperbolic space has a chi-squared that's essentially 0, which means that this space fits the data really well, or it fits basically the behavioral space of people's cognitive distances between objects very well. Just to show you visually intuitions about this space, here is a map of how the concepts in the things database are organized in a hyperbolic space and Euclidean space. And what you can see in the hyperbolic space is that these natural groupings of object categories fall out. Like you see animals clustered together, food clusters together, tools and clothing clustered together, while maybe this is less interpretable in a Euclidean space. But importantly for us, we were curious, how do these different measures relate to memorability? Or in other words, are memorable items really at the roots of this cognitive space? And so while I mentioned that the best fitting hyperbolic space had only 3 dimensions of a radius and 2 angles, the 2 angles, they're hard to interpret, but the radius is very interpretable because that is the distance from the origin of the space. And if I'm proposing that memorable items are at the roots of our cognitive networks, then that means that memorability should be related to the radius. And what we find is indeed a significant negative correlation between memorability and radius, where more memorable items are closer to the center of the hyperbolic space. And we explain much more variance in memorability using this hyperbolic space than a Euclidean space. So overall, what this suggests to us is that memorability may indeed reflect an item's location in memory, with memorable items at the roots of our cognitive maps. Yeah, so overall, what I've shown you in this portion of the talk is that semantic features have the greatest impact on what we remember and forget. It's not low-level visual features. We find that hyperbolic geometry captures our object perceptual and memory space. And we have a new preprint out, but our hope is that we're also going to make it very easy to do these hyperbolic transformations, where you can take any sort of distance matrix that you have and then run it into a package that we make publicly available to see, does a hyperbolic space fit your data best? And I've also shown you evidence that memorable items might be those that are the roots of our cognitive spaces. And so overall, what I've shown you is that memory is predictable from images, even in real-world settings, using artificial intelligence, and that memorable items might reflect how items are positioned in our cognitive maps. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I'm really excited for a discussion. Do we need microphones? Oh, okay. I'll take some water.
Yes, I can.
Oh, is it not working? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. semantic salience grabs your attention more, and therefore you memorize it better. So, and maybe there's even a way to distinguish the two. Like, if you don't pay attention to an image, is it still memorable, or is it just, yeah, attentional salience?
Yeah, so we find repeatedly across multiple studies that surprisingly, this is really orthogonal from attention. So we find that memorable items are not necessarily the most visually salient items if you run like a visual saliency algorithm.
Also like semantic salience then, because you also show that it's not about low-level visual, but more about...
So maybe we might need to chat more about how to measure semantic saliency, but maybe I'll run through some other things that we found first. So we found that memorable items don't necessarily pop out in a visual search. We also find that if you try to direct your top-down attentional control, that doesn't impact memorability effects. So for example, even if I pay you money, you cannot remember forgettable items or forget memorable items. Even if you're doing a task that's orthogonal to the images, like judging the color of a fixation cross on an image, and then I surprise you with a memory task, you'll still remember the memorable ones more. And we also have a recent study showing that if we measure your like real-time sustained or attentional state by basically having you do this really boring task and measuring your reaction time, we find that memorability effects are totally orthogonal to your current attentional state. So if you're not, whether you're paying attention or not, if I show you a memorable image, you're going to remember it as long as your eyes are open. And conversely, even if you're in a really heightened attentional state, if I show you something forgettable, you can't remember it. And so we have a recent study where we actually manipulate both. So we basically can design cognitive interfaces where we maximize your memory, because we can find that like when you're really paying attention, maybe we can give you like middling memorability things, and when you're not paying attention, I can give you very memorable things to really like make you remember the maximum possible, because these two effects are so orthogonal. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, in the back, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I have a question about context. So it seems to me like the size of the set and the content of the set, like how dissimilar or similar the other items are to each other, perhaps by category. And also the person's experience might affect memorability. So I'm thinking there about in-group, out-group biases in race and face discrimination. So when you say that an image is intrinsically memorable, do you mean for all humans in all contexts, or is it intrinsic with an asterisk?
Yeah, so of course, if you really manipulate context, that's going to affect people's memory. So if I show you like 100 memorable flowers and 1 forgettable rock, you'll still remember that you saw a rock. Like context definitely plays a role. But in these more naturalistic settings where you don't have very extreme context, we find that memorability overwhelmingly contributes more to your memory than context. So one way we tested this is that with our large things database, or our large experiment with like close to 14,000 participants, participants saw a random subset of 187 of the images overall. And so just by chance, some people might have certain types of context over others. In other words, we can run mini experiments within our data to look at context effects. So for example, one person might by chance have an experiment where they happen to see lots of musical instruments. So there, I call that an experiment that's like a high context one. Like there's a lot of like role of context. And then there might be some participants where they only see a single musical instrument, so like a low context experiment. And what we found was that there was no significant difference in people's memory for an item when it was in a high context situation versus low context situation. And there was a significant correlation in the scores between the two. So in other words, in these more naturalistic settings where you're not just seeing like tons of rocks or tons of flowers in one rock, memorability will win out over context. Then for your question about participant characteristics, so we found that our neural network can predict memory in people as young as 4 years of age. There's still culture, and so there's these great potential educational applications. So of course, kids still have some culture at 4 years of age. There has been work showing that it works cross-culturally, not from my lab, but for example, there's this other race effect where like Koreans will not remember German faces as well as Korean faces, but what they've found is that the rankings stay the same. So like 2 are Korean, the most memorable German face is also the most memorable German face to German participants, if that makes sense. And then finally, there's some work from Nicole Rust at UPenn, who finds that even monkeys remember and forget the same images, which is interesting. I'm still trying to wrap my head around with these results we have here about semantics really playing a big role. Yeah. Oh yeah, there's in the back, yeah. Yeah, so I agree that, yeah, so it has been shown in a lot of prior work that negative emotional stimuli tend to be remembered better, I think. So one thing with the Art Institute studies, it is possible that they don't have huge ranges of emotion because it is like this family-friendly public exhibit. So it is possible they didn't have hugely negative or hugely positive pieces. Also, there is a recent preprint from 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗺𝗶𝗴𝗍, her lab, showing that while emotionality of an image impacts memory performance, I think she finds no interaction effects with memorability effects as judged by something like our neural network. So we can think of these as probably separate constructs that impact memory. But yeah, I am curious, if you really push like emotionality of a piece to extreme, what would come out? One interesting thing is, for our art contest, we had actually a documentary come and record some of the artists entering the contest and interview them. And they asked the artists, would you rather that your piece be very emotional, elicit a lot of meaning and deep reflection, but be forgettable? Or would you rather someone pass by it, not think anything of it, but remember it? And both of them said they'd rather have the memorable piece, even if it doesn't elicit any emotion, which I thought was really interesting. Yeah.
Wilma, great talk as always.
Thanks.
I had a question about the last group you were talking about, the 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗺𝗶𝗱𝗴𝗲 space.
Yeah.
So it wasn't clear based on what you said and set it up, but it seems like you need to be able to estimate the knowledge tree in a way that isn't itself corrupted by the measure you're trying to measure. So how do you, in terms of the distance matrix that you were using and basing that on, how is that not also, if it's based on human ratings, how is it not maybe potentially corrupted by memorability?
Oh, yeah, so.
That's the first part. And then the other part is, are there any spaces that are a better match to the Euclidean space than the hyperbolic space? In other words, is hyperbolic just more powerful in some way, or like it's harder to compare the degrees of freedom between those two things?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, sorry if I wasn't clear about this, but so basically what we did is we have the 49 features for each image, which are things like, is this animal related, man-made, red, blah, blah, blah. We then take the distances between all pairs of items in the 49-dimensional feature space with like correlations and make a distance matrix. So that there, it's only capturing people's ratings of behavioral similarity from the things database. And that's what's fed into the hyperbolic transformation. So there's no memory in there. It's nothing from our memory experiment and no memorability in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
That matrix, the 49 dimensions, is that?
It's a perceptual similarity space. Like, and this is from the things database, so I won't take credit for this work, but originally people would see like 3 objects and pick which is the odd one out, and from there they can calculate the similarity of different items.
Based on human ratings about what's similar.
Yeah, but perceptually similar, so it doesn't reflect memory necessarily, but except unless if it's that memorability. Yeah, and yeah, so but it is then orthogonal from our memorability measure, or the fact that memorability does relate to this perceptual space then suggests maybe something about our cognitive spaces is like memorability is capturing something about our cognitive spaces. Then your second question, oh, I'm blanking. Can you? Oh. Yeah, so this hyperbolic geometry stuff, to my knowledge, is relatively new. So the main work I've seen relating it to human perceptual spaces is in odor perception. And so we're hoping with this work that we can make it easy to use like package so that anyone can test their spaces, and then we can see, yeah, is everything better hyperbolically, or maybe more things that we'd expect take on a more like network-like organization. And one question we're testing right now is, are there, like if we look at the ventral visual stream in the brain, are there some maybe earlier parts that are more Euclideanly represented, and then later parts might be more hyperbolically represented? Yeah.
Okay, maybe question of mine. First of all, thanks for this very thought-provoking and memorable talk.
Yay,
but I have so many questions, I have to narrow them down. But one of the questions from the Art Museum project was, did you ever test whether memorable pieces create a better memory for where they were seen? So of the space, if you would show them later on just the images of those pieces of art, would they be able to locate those pieces of art that are more memorable better? I mean, do that generate a more memorable space as well?
That's a good question. So we haven't tested that. We have some like preliminary work not yet published, finding that memorable items, like memorability does bleed out to associations. So if you have a memorable item, or oh yeah, for example, we actually do have a preprint out showing that if you have a memorable symbol, then it will let you remember the word attached to that symbol better. Like we've generated novel symbols, like symbols for democracy and revenge, and you can remember that word associated with it better if the symbol, the visual features of the symbol itself are memorable. But spatially, we haven't tried it. I think 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗺 actually has a study where they find that memorability impacts your ability, or makes it easier to remember when something happened, but not where, if I'm remembering the results correctly, but I need to go double check. Yeah.
One little question is the time space of memorability. Like how long does this last? Right? How long does
Oh, yeah.
for example, truly predict memorability of, is it just like the next 5 minutes, the next hour, the next 2 days, a year?
Yeah, so we haven't tried it with 𝗕𝗶𝗹𝗺, but 𝗕𝗶𝗶𝗹𝗺 in some of his early work found that this can stretch out at least a week, and we just haven't tried longer. There is one study in computer vision showing that there are intrinsically more memorable or forgettable movie scenes from movies people saw in their childhood. So I would predict this lasts like long, months or years. Yeah.
So we have in this order, that one, here, there.
I was wondering, did you ever try to dissect 𝗕𝗏𝗺 to see what actually makes images memorable for 𝗕𝗏𝗺 and if those features align with humans?
Yeah, so when we look at 𝗕𝗏𝗺, I don't have the slides in here, but it looks like these standard visual neural networks if we look at what sorts of features drive the different layers most. So early layers look like low-level visual features, like it's basically oriented edges. And then if you look at later layers, you see object shapes emerge like eyeballs and arches. But we don't see anything that pops out to us as like anything more about memory than what you might see in like a visual neural network. Yeah.
And did you try to check which parts of the image directly drive a high memorability versus low memorability score to see is there something directly on the image that really drives memorability?
Oh, like pixel location in
For
the
example,
image?
yeah.
Yeah, there have been methods to get heat maps of what drives memorability. I mean, in general, more centrally located items are more memorable, but it's hard to know because like most photographs have like a centrally located item. So we haven't delved into that deeply, but there are methods available to do that. Yeah. Hello.
So I was curious if you think that memorability conveys resilience to degradation in situations like semantic dementia. And I was
thinking about the work of Tyler and Moss and colleagues from some time ago with connectionist models, where they argued that, you know, concepts that are defined by a lot of shared features seem to be more resilient to loss, and if there's a connection there to memorability.
That's interesting. I think that would be interesting to test. Yeah, and actually, we have a preprint out now with Morgan Berens showing that memorable items benefit more from consolidation during sleep too, which maybe suggests they're protected more from interference. I haven't tested things with semantic dementia, but we do have a line of work looking at Alzheimer's dementia, and there the results are, well, I'm curious what you think about these, but basically for typical aging adults, we find that ResMem or can predict people's memory just fine. Like older adults remember the same images as younger adults. But when someone starts to develop Alzheimer's dementia, then there are some images that are memorable to typical individuals but forgettable to those with these early stages of Alzheimer's dementia, which we've been using to mean these are actually intrinsically diagnostic images. So if you use these images in a test, you can diagnose people with these early stages of dementia better than if you use a random set of images. But so we've been applying that in a more, or we've been using that in a more applied sense, but I'm curious, would that go against your ideas of the resilience? Or maybe there's like certain memorable images that don't quite fall under this like resilience hypothesis. Yeah. I don't know, I think it'd be super cool to test, yeah.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I'm not very familiar with the hyperbolic space, so I wanted to ask you, so in what is different from like other nonlinear dimensionality reductions like ISOMAP, for instance, which is graph-based?
Oh, yeah, I haven't, so, yeah, I'm not familiar with the ISOMAP method. Is it one where you can take these like continuous featured like measures and then transform something into this graph-based space? Is that?
Yeah, you take the Euclidean distance between the points, and if they are below threshold, they are connected. They don't are connected. Otherwise, they're not. And then you compute the distance between the nodes that are connected.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it does feel like it would end up resulting in a different space than this one, but yeah, I mean, I'm curious, we're interested in trying other different space types. If you want to like email me, or if anyone wants to email me different spaces, and we can just plug the data into all of the different spaces and see which best explains the data. Yeah.
My question has actually already partly addressed by Luca, but so I was wondering, can you ask ResMem to hallucinate so that it creates very memorable or very forgettable images? Could this help you to understand better what features actually are?
Yeah. Yeah, so there is some work from a different neural network that uses like GANs, basically, to create more memorable or forgettable versions of images. And they have found that that can manipulate people's memory differentially. We're also interested in implementing that on ResMem, but we haven't done that quite yet. One interesting thing is we did have it enter our art contest. So we did try and make the most memorable piece of art and most forgettable piece of art. And the forgettable one was incredibly forgettable. Like we didn't let it really win because we want to give money to real people, but surprisingly the memorable piece didn't quite work. So I still need to think about why. I mean, it tried to make a human portrait and the hands were all garbled, so it could just be like the limitations in these generative models for making realistic human-like figures. But yeah, but it's definitely possible. And you can imagine all these interesting applications if you can upweight the memorability of images. So.
Thanks so much for a really interesting talk. I'm wondering whether the outcomes you get would differ based on the type of memory test you give. So like, your recognition memory is much better for low frequency words. Free recall is better for high frequency words. So if you instead ask people, tell me a list of all the paintings you saw, often memories are kind of not recognition, they're kind of what you remember from your day. You make it
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we have found that these effects work fairly well across different paradigms within recognition memory. So what I've shown you are these continuous recognition tasks, but ResMem can predict what people remember in these study test paradigms where you study a bunch of images and then test people's memory. I guess that's what our art museum experiment was like. And it also works in these surprise recognition tasks where do this unrelated perceptual task and then I'll surprise test your memory for these items. But for recognition versus recall, we do find actually evidence that these are separable constructs. So there is like a recognition-based memorability and a recall-based memorability. We did this within the context of a drawing study where we had people draw images that they remembered, and what they drew from free recall was totally different from what they remembered in a recognition-based task. So, and in the word domain, there's also been some recent work showing that verbally recognizable items are different from those that are recallable. So that is definitely a avenue we're interested in going down and understanding what different features make something recognizable versus recallable. Yeah.
Wilma, you should be able to predict my question because
is it a memorable question?
So whether it's recall or recognition, it's all based on explicit measures of memory, by definition, memorability. But items can differ in their primability. Explicit measures. And maybe you remember that Steve Dodson and I brought this issue up years ago. And in other words, what is the relationship between, at the item level, between primability and memorability? And my recollection was you did a quick little study, and the answer was, as I remember, that they seem to be independent. Did you ever follow up on that?
Oh yeah, so I haven't, because I found that they were unrelated, I haven't followed up on that. So just to let everyone know what we found, basically we did a repetition priming task where people had to categorize scene images as indoor or outdoor, and we found that, and then we gave them a surprise memory test after. We found that, we found classic priming effects, but we didn't find that the level of priming differed based on the memorability of the stimulus. But when we did a surprise recognition task, people did remember the memorable items better than the forgettable ones. We didn't follow up on it because we didn't find a relationship between primability and memorability, but is there a potential direction you think might be interesting to pursue? Yeah.
Because it seemed it might have particular relevance for your second point about spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we are really interested in digging into these different distance measures in the cognitive space. Another question we're also interested in is false alarmability and memorability, because it is sort of surprising that memorable things are more typical. You might think false alarmable items would be more typical too. So yeah, we're interested in looking at all these different measures in the cognitive space. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, so I think you always use image sets that are curated from the web, right? And I have the feeling that these images are already very special because they are taken and also worked afterwards, designed to be already high in memorability because people want their images to be seen. And I remember a work by 𝗕ᗶ𝗹𝗺𝗏 and colleague.
Yeah,
These special images are very different from what we call natural visual design. For example, and you see this in one of your images, that the close-up of animals, they are very high resolution in the foreground, the bird in the background, actually, an algorithm could say whether there is an animal or not in the scene, just based on the context
Yeah, so for your first question, that would be an interesting and really relatively easy question to test if we have a good data set of our naturalistic visual diets. My prediction, my relatively confident prediction is that there would still be intrinsic, memorable, and forgettable items in our natural visual diets, and that ResMem would be able to predict them. And this is because ResMem, we've been surprised at how well it does at such a wide range of stimulus sets. So the fact that it can predict people's memory for art in this real world setting. There's also some work finding that it can predict people's memory for symbols, which are a very different type of stimulus set, like hashtag, @. There's also, some of my prior work, I mentioned it briefly in the beginning, but we find that, we found that memorability is stable within a person's identity. So someone who is memorable across different emotional expressions. There's like a microphone running. Okay, someone who's memorable, whose face is memorable across different emotions. Also, their memorability remains constant across different viewpoints. And if memorability is so consistent across different images of an individual, this makes me think it shouldn't matter what the image is, as long as that person is memorable. And so I think this would translate also to like scene images or other stimulus types. So I think it'd be interesting to test, but I wouldn't be surprised if I think it should probably work there too. Your second question was on, fixations. So let me remember. There is some work on memorability and eye tracking, not from my own lab, but in general, I don't think it's that people necessarily fixate memorable items first, and that goes along with this result that memorable items are not necessarily the most visually salient items. But it is that if people spend more time looking at the more memorable items within a scene, then they will do a better job at remembering it later. And if they reinstate those fixations to memorable items, they'll do a better job. Yeah.
Hi, Wilma. That was a lovely talk. I'm really inspired by your sort of tenacious, experimental approach. The amount of data that you're bringing to bear, both in this and all your questions, is really inspiring.
Thanks.
And the scale of them is awesome. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question more about a conceptual framework, like how you're thinking about this. And so one of the claims you had at the end was memorable items are closer to the roots of our cognitive map. And I am thinking about this handoff between where things go from low-level visual to more visuosemantic to semantic, and that perceptual conceptual interface that is, treacherous ground. How do we navigate that? And sometimes it seemed like what you were saying was something, this is more, I'll call it visuosemantic, like these are about image features. There's something about the image statistics in the context of the set of other image or natural image manifold that makes them stick out in a certain way that maybe then connects to, say, hippocampal memory mechanism. But then other times it seemed like you were saying it's more about maybe prior knowledge, that these hook on to things we know. This is a category, this is not a visual hook that's supporting the memorability, and then maybe that would have a different brain region and sort of mechanism supporting it. And I'm wondering just like where you're thinking about what this cognitive map is and how it fits with, say, being biased, like a high-level visual representation you might find in occipital-temporal cortex or IT. Like, is it there? I'll stop it there. Okay,
that's
good.
tricky because I guess the way I think of the conceptual hooks here is still in like late visual, ventral visual stream. So my prediction is that this is happening around the pararhinal cortex. So we do have some early neuroimaging work, or like work from many years ago, where we scanned people's brains while they saw memorable and forgettable items doing an orthogonal task. And we do see it's really like inferior temporal cortex, so like later ventral visual stream, and then what looks like pararhinal cortex that's sensitive to memorability, but like pararhinal cortex is notably hard to image. So my hope is to try doing that later, or find a data set that already has imaged the pararhinal cortex. So I think, some of my thought around this is that we can't remember everything we see, so our brains need to know how to filter our visual worlds. And so maybe this memorability is picking up on how we're filtering all of this visual information. And so maybe this is something that is happening at this pararhinal cortex, interface of vision and memory. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Do I get to ask a question too?
I think so.
I'm one of those people who's sort of borderline aphantasia type person.
Oh, cool.
And I have very poor memory. So the question is, perhaps people who have good memory, they're all the same. And those of us who have problems memory, we're all different. Have you tried to look at the dimension of, I wouldn't use the word disability, but difference in terms of what is going on? So are people like me behaving very differently in terms of the dimensions you've come up with? And could that be a helpful clue, perhaps, to what is going on in those who have good memories?
Yeah, it's true. So here we're really looking at stimulus effects averaged across people. But I do think the next piece is really bringing the individual differences question. So as I was mentioning to, I think it was to Brad, that we have some early work, at least looking at individuals who are developing early dementias or Alzheimer's dementias. And there we are finding that that group performs differently from healthy older individuals. So it would be interesting then to look at other individuals with other forms of memory impairment or visual impairments, or even just people who are on different ends of individual differences in memory. Yeah, let me think. I mean, I've done a recent study where it's not published yet, but it's just submitted, where I look at what factors predict the trial-by-trial performance in these things memory data. And we find that really it is the individual differences that make the biggest contribution. So if someone's bad at memory or a poor performer, like, it's very hard to save them from that. But the second most important thing is the memorability of the image, beyond other factors like the serial position of the item or the context. So yeah, I think it will be really interesting to look at the convergence of individual differences in stimulus.
Well, your presentation was so beautiful that you didn't get any questions sort of challenging what you've been saying. I just wanted to touch on one thing. You used these models, these computer models, and you say that they seem to account for some of the results of the behavioral account. And are we exchanging one black box for another? I mean, so we now have a model, and what did you learn from that? So that the later stages show whatever, stronger effects in the early stages. Is that the importance of the study? Is it something about those models that is revealing something about the way the mind works?
By models, do you mean the neural network model,
yes.
Or do you mean the hyper?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, for the neural network model, a lot of that was like, I do not claim that our neural network ResMem is a biologically valid model of the human brain. But what I think is really surprising and theoretically important is that without any sort of memory built into it, it can do a really good job at predicting people's memory, which shows that a lot of our memories is something that our visual system can do, or like our visual system contributes a lot to what we end up remembering and forgetting. We don't, like, this model doesn't have like a hippocampus in it. And also the fact that it can predict people's memory, I mean, now it's basically, you can think of it as a stand-in for how well do adults perform at memory. So the fact that it can predict 4-year-old kids' memory, I don't take that as, I mean, it has useful practical applications, but also shows that young kids have adult-like patterns in what they remember and forget. And so that gives us a theoretical contribution there. Or the fact that it can predict people's memory for artwork shows that even in these noisy naturalistic settings, people's memories are really driven by the stimulus. So I think its ability to predict in these different settings shows just how consistent people's memories are, and I think that's theoretically important. But I don't necessarily say this neural network itself is how our memory, like our memory system, and we should look at it and like, I wouldn't claim like, oh, this layer corresponds to this region of the brain. Yeah.
And there's one final question, and then we're done.
Hey, thanks. Great talk. So one quick question was, one result that I was puzzled by, and I still can't kind of wrap my head around it, was the Reddit findings. where you show that images are more likely to be liked if it was more memorable. And the reason I say I can't quite get my head around it was because, in a way, people have been thinking about that Reddit and online material as almost antithetical to memory. People call it cognitive offloading, right? You don't need to think of it as memory. Now, you did say at one point that one predictor was interest, and whether an image was interesting, which I could certainly see as being a predictor of whether someone likes or shares something on it. So yeah, I just wondered if you could expand on what you think is happening there in a material domain that almost by its essence doesn't need memory and is put in place so that we don't have to use memory to some extent.
That's an interesting way to think about social media. Yeah, so for the interestingness results for the art, those were separate contributions. So interestingness and ResMem had contributed separate amounts of variance to the memory prediction. And if I remember correctly, they weren't so correlated with each other. And actually, we have found in prior work that people's subjective impressions of what's memorable often doesn't relate to what actually is memorable. So there, we think interestingness is picking up on something different from memorability. It would be, interesting to get interestingness scores for the Reddit post and see how well those do. Some of my thought for the Reddit finding is that if an image is memorable, maybe then it causes you to share it more with other people and they remember it better to share it. Like, if I see a cool image but I don't remember that I saw it, like if I forget it soon after, maybe I'm less likely to then think to share it because you have to hold something in working memory to share it on social media. That was sort of my guess, but it would be interesting to see if there's some way to measure the degree to which a social media post reflects memory offloading, and if that relates to memorability at all. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a brilliant talk and lots of questions. Now